Good evening, everybody, and welcome to age 642. Today I will take up a paper written by Matthew King, published in Philosophy Today in the autumn of 2007. It's titled Heidegger's Etymological Method. And it's about the German philosopher Martin Heidegger and that method that became his
Trademark.
Something taken up by later philosophers, to mention an Austrian like Feyerabend also used the etymological method. But to my knowledge, Heidegger was the first. And Matthew King goes up to tell that it's very few people have mentioned this tendency before, which is quite interesting in itself. There is a shallow mentioning by a chap named Frank Shallow. He calls it language and the etymological turn of thought. It seems rather that Matthew King means with the etymological method, Heidegger doesn't strive to limit or define meaning, but rather to recover a whole range of historical meanings of a word. So the purpose is to open up meaning that has become too tight or too narrow, and it's contrary to the analytical method that strives to limit meaning, restrict meaning. This is a different turn altogether. And he also sees new connection, for instance, the etymological link between thinking and thanking, which is also, by the way, rather similar in Swedish as well. Tänka och tacka. And what Heidegger is trying to point to, as he does in other areas of his philosophy, is beware of tightening, limiting too much. It's counterproductive. He wants to broaden perspectives. He wants to take in more, where he gets the feeling that what he calls academic philosophy is that tendency to limit too much, to make things too harsh, too little and too small. And this is what one usually calls, and Heidegger might be in the first to mention, it could have been Nietzsche, but why do we do this? There is a technical and scientific purpose. So one could say this tightening of meaning is coming from science, or how we perceive science, something like that. And therefore, in order to better philosophy or better thinking or thanking, whatever you mention, you try to restrict meaning. But Heidegger means the purpose of philosophy is to broaden meaning. And he calls this special epoch das Gestell. and that could be rephrased in English, besetting of things by technological enfrainment. Technical and scientific purposes are the only ones that ordinary can show themselves. And we've spoken about this before. What shows itself, it's what we are. It could be what turns up, something that is malfunctioning, that ordinary works, but it can also be that something we decide to bring up. And those cases is in Heidegger's eyes similar. And it's the first time we see the thing when it's malfunctioning or when we purposely bring it up. And we need to be aware about this tendency because it makes for a very special philosophy. And what happens when we restrict meaning to word, or we try to, as Heidegger called it, enfrainment, put them into frame boxes? Well, language doesn't work the same way anymore. Heidegger means meaning is to have a broad base. Less meaning is bad. And that can be compared to ordinary words that usually have a very broad meaning. You can use them in different contexts. Some of these words we call hymnonyms because they differ so much, but sometimes they are somewhat closer in meaning, and it makes for the purpose of meaning to have the play between the different meanings. I know this is a poetic device, I forgot the name of it, but poetry is a good example anyway, because in poetry you are like a guitarist who let the strings vibrate. And what is vibration in poetry? Well, it's the jumping between the different meanings, so to speak. And I even think that Heidegger means like the late Wittgenstein. It's not even a question of different meanings. It's just a broad base. And we could take it apart and say, oh, hey, we have different meanings here. But you would never, ever do that in ordinary language. It's a completely weird thing to do. It's a vorhanden, without a doubt. And what it would do, if you did it very often, is you stop the flow of language. And you will stop the power of language to have a meaning, to have a purpose, to be working well. Normally, what happens is that we almost do not hear the words. And this is what Heidegger in Being and Time calls Gerede, idle talk. Gerede is the mood to be entangled, caught up in things. When we are busy with our practical pursuits, doing our chores, being engaged in ordinary life, talk just goes hand in hand. It's just a part of all those things we are doing in the daily life. Going to work, doing our job, meeting people, transferring money or what have you, making pea soup. That's part of daily life. And words, meanings and language accompany that in a very, very loose way. But still, the thing is, in idle talk, in Gerede, it does not bring us to the being, because that language is caught up in the daily activities. It's already engaged. It needs to be grounded if you want to go somewhere else. This is what Heidegger, not oddly, calls Boden, its floor. And this floor or ground of the matter that needs to be appropriated, that's the being of beings. And of course in our daily lives we must almost always omit going back to it. Only rarely do we have the time and the space to attend to it. We are in that case attending rather than just using language, being caught up in it. And I think Heidegger mentions a few examples of that when we are maybe on vacation and looking over the sea, or being in a boat and nothing really happens. And it's then you start to attend to being, and that's when you put your feet on the ground and you stop for a second and you look at things. To think is before else to listen. Listen to what our words say. Hear what the being of beings is. The word gives being to us. If our thinking does justice to the matter, then we may never say of the word that is, but rather that it gives. And that's a difference. And I think this is in the core of the etymological method. It is when you put your feet on the ground and you're almost stop for a minute. You don't stop completely, but you're not as engaged in ordinary life as you usually are. And you start attending to things, and to attend to things is actually broadening meanings of the words. That's the etymological term. And Heidegger means here, I think, when you are caught up in language, there is no chance of broadening, because you don't even reflect on language. And it can, in this process, become a little automaticated. It becomes under the surface and you don't notice it. And if you want to get closer to being or reveal being, and I think as Heidegger would say, entdeckt is the term he uses. You need to attend to the meaning. So, would in this circumstance that is quite different from one could think of philosophy to be, is it in this specific case appropriate to speak of Heidegger's etymological method at all? Well, if you go into the meaning of the word method, if this is a method, we first have to investigate what does the word method be? What is it? Well, it's constructed of meta, which means after or going that way, and odos, which is road or path. Going to the path. You're going somewhere, you are stepping on a specific turnpike, you could call it, going somewhere. And this is not the technical rigor of the analytical method. It could be confused to be that. But in my meaning, and I don't think Matthew King meets that either, it's not the restrictive look at meaning of words you should look for here. It's rather, or if you go into what the word was from the beginning, its use, what would happen is not a narrowing. It may feel that way. And when I heard this the first time before I read it, I did think a little bit those lexicon we used to have in Sweden here. And you look up a word and you usually see some phrase there. It could be a verb or noun. It could be colloquial or informal or formal. Not seldom you see the term LT, which means Low German. 60% of our vocabulary is Low German. No, it's not really that, because this is an analytical method. Looking in the lexicon is an analytical method. And although he wants to see where it started, to broaden is his purpose. It's a little bit like in ordinary use, the language becomes narrow because you don't attend to it. A little bit like you're not watering a plant. It becomes less. We want language to thrive. And in a sense, it could be easier to understand if you go back and look at the word, you find what we, from a modern sense, would say multiple meanings. One of those words that struck me is the word kåt in Swedish. It means jolly, but can also mean horny. But at the time, with very famous Swedish poet and singer-songwriter Bellman, it was just sort of changing its meaning, going from the more harmless meaning to the more erotic meaning. But actually, he was using it in both senses. But when he was using it in both senses, that was not on purpose. You have to think that there was still a broad meaning going on. So he didn't think, when I write this, I'm going to have two meanings. No, no, no. It was definitely not that. I thought so in the beginning, but no, it wasn't. It was a broader meaning. And a broader meaning means more meaningful. It could mean one or the other from the point where I'm standing now in the modern times. I can look, what did Bellman mean here? Or I do analysis here. I look into it. I say, oh, hey, I got two meanings here. I better write them down, meaning one and meaning two. That's what I thought. But no, I'm quite certain that was not the case. It's obvious for lyric reasons, but it's also obviously look for many other words in the lyrics of Bellman. And he doesn't have a double meaning. It's a broader meaning, and that's quite different. It's not really the same thing. And this is very interesting, actually. It's things I've been wondering about a long time. But this could actually be a helper to understand what Heidegger was pointing to. It's not like he wants to have 5 meanings instead of 3 meanings. And that's better to have 5. He wants to show that words used to be broader. And they always get broader when you go back in time. The tendency to define words come by time. When you have a huge period of Gerede and you have idle talk, it's an automatic narrowing. Not much, but little by little, it gets more narrow. And he does not want to do academic philosophy to narrow it even more. What he wants to do is broaden it. And that's quite a different thing, even though it can be a little bit hard to understand. Well, hey, we're talking about Heidegger. Hard to understand, it's almost synonymous with Heidegger. Now that's what makes the chap so interesting, I think. But you can see, literally, when we get a broader meaning, we get a broader base. We stand on firmer ground. That sort of language could, in some perspective, when I stand here in the now, where we are now in 2021, and look back, I could also say, Bellman or who Shakespeare, whoever it was, that word is using in a very narrow sense. But that's from my perspective. It seems that way. But what it is actually is a broader meaning is like having a broader hammer. It hits more nail at the same time. That's the point. And it also makes some sense now with the method. A way of going about things. Could be seen as an alternative to the Gerede, something you do in your leisurely time, when you have the opportunity. But it could also be something that you consciously apply. A road you want to step on more often. That's a way of going about. But Heidegger wants to point out, when he talks about method, he means it in the broader sense. So it's not a scientific method, because a scientific method in itself is this analytical. It's a different doing altogether. Scientific method is in its nature narrowing. And I think that is something we come to understand during this series. A technological thinking is inherently narrowing. It must be. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. And here we come to understand that we could be speaking of 2 different paths to take, and we can choose for ourselves which one we prefer to take. But the more we understand that the scientific method have to be sharpening, more defining, more analytical. Because what do you do in science? Well, you define things. Science is about defining things for the purpose of making them to work. That's the idea of science. But the idea of living is quite different. The idea of talking is not at all like that. But we could be tricked into thinking that. And that is very much connected to ex anteriori, I don't know if I got that right, or ex posteriori. And that goes to point, it's depending from which perspective you look. If you want to look at etymology from a scientific perspective, you would see it as an analytical method. And if your case, it actually is that way. That lexicon I was talking about earlier, that does that. It piles up the different meanings in order of use. So the most important, highest up is number 1, and the second is number 2. That's one thing. But this etymology is different in a way. It's always about broadening, never about narrowing. That would be very counterproductive to narrow, because that's a purpose of science. That's the purpose of the academic philosophy. I'd say modern academic philosophy. And here we come to the type of language. That's not unimportant in this case. It would be if we were talking about method in the first meaning. But now we're talking about the broadening and the history. And Heidegger himself thought that German, the German language, was second to Greek only when it came to convey philosophical thinking. And part of the reason to that is that, for instance, English is a hybrid language. And that means that narrowing is always in process in English. You already have in your mind different meanings for different words, because you have 2 or 3 or 4 bases for the language. Whereas in German you only have 1 base, and Greek the same, Latin the same, French the same. English is a hybrid. So you really have, from the beginning, a division between different words. And there is a reason English has become the language for the technical word. It's always analyzing itself. That's what happens if you have a hybrid language. You need to know the levels of language. It's even so weird in English to have 2 different words for beehive. And then you need to, as a speaker, to discern between these 2, because they don't carry the same weight. So you always have this restricted etymology about it. You can, well, I think a good way of looking is that when one language enters another language, what happens is you have a translation going on. You have 2 people in one language. It's a bit schizophrenic. Many people said that English is a schizophrenic language because of this. It's 2 people in one. That's a bit exaggerated, I would say. It's a full whole language. Now what happens, you have an interaction, and you have in the language always some need of translation. And that translation never stopped. Still to this day, people wonder what should that word be used for, because we haven't defined it in the other language. It's actually quite an interesting case, and I like the point that Heidegger makes about English. It's a technological language. Where did the Industrial Revolution start? It started in England. Second, Scotland. Both of those countries speak English. I always thought that English is not like other languages at all, just because of this weird analytical power and the struggle between the two sides of the language. And the even weirder thing, it's a German language grammatically seen, but the vocabulary is at least 60–70% Latin. And that's make it a bit more complicated case than Greek and German. But there's another thing, oddly enough, thanks for this mixture, it's not like the two parts become more conservative. No, on the contrary, they became much more fluid. So a modern English speaker has a hard time already understanding the language of Shakespeare. And if you go back to medieval language, it's very hard for them to understand Chaucer, and go all the way back to Old English, the English of the Saxons. You lost 95% of the population. It's not at all that bad in German. They can, in German, fairly well read the language of the Goths. It's not that hard for them. And when you come to the Greek, I don't know, but I get the feeling they understand even quite a bit of the language of Homer, or at least maybe Plato. So that's an interesting difference. So here we have a completely different view than the ordinary academic philosophy. For them, all languages are more or less the same somehow. But we've spoken about that before. All differences are ignored in the technological thinking mode. The scientific method is about eradicating differences. The scientific method, it's a method with a very, very specific purpose, and it's incredibly narrow. It's such a small part of life, and it's always connected to machinery. And machinery is very little part of daily life at all. Most people don't even understand machinery. But it's odd that the language of machinery rules our thinking mode. And those are one of the points that Heidegger does. And I think part of the helping method, the methodos, the road to be taken, it is by broadening meaning. He's seen a sharpening of meaning, a more distinctive meaning, a more defined meaning coming about because of influence from technological thinking, especially in the last 2 centuries. So he wants to heal language a bit. He wants to heal us, and the methodos is a road to be taken to ponder these things a little bit. And then you can go back to Gureda. You can always go back to Gureda. The last thing I should mention, I think I have to make 2 lectures on this. It's a very informative paper. It's very, very good. It gives me shivers to read about etymology, because it's one of my favorites. And seeing it together with Heidegger is the both of best of 2 worlds, without a doubt. But I think we mentioned this long time ago, and that's looking at words as disclosive or looking at words as buckets and kegs. Or Heidegger tries to subvert our nearly unshakable assumption that words and their reference are independent objects between which determinate relations can be fixed. And yet this gives us the feeling that words and things can be used as if they are interchangeable. And this is similar to he says, be wary of the academic method. And the reason is you start thinking that words are interchangeable in a way that not. By narrowing the meaning, you could say these two words equal that word. Almost like saying yellow plus red equals orange. You can say orange means red plus yellow. And a red car could be a fire car. And sometimes it looks like you have a relation between a word and some other things, something in the world. And we try to think that that relation is equiponcial, so it's always the same regardless which word it is. There was a view that the earlier Wittgenstein had simplified word view. That the relation between a word and its meaning is different from word to word. Sometimes the word in itself has factors that springs to attention, like the word oops, which is an attention giver in itself, but it also refers to the state that look out for something. And that's very interesting, because we tend, I think because of this technological influence, and of course the amnesia thing, I won't get into the amnesia thing. I don't want this lecture to end at 3 a.m. But it's also very interesting. But the general tendency is when you use technological thinking, you start thinking that all words and their relations to the thing are equal in some way. But they're not. Let me make a comparison. You can have a stop sign on the road, and that tells you to stop. So there's a reference to the stopping from the sign. But you can also have betongsugga. Betongsugga is also a stopping sign.
Cement.
But
Cementblock.
No. But what it does is that it stops you as well. It does literally stop you. And this is, of course, is a bit exaggerated, but what Wittgenstein tried to tell us, do not assume that the relationship between words and their meaning or their thing is always the same. It varies from word to word. There could be a group of words that have a very similar referent. I have a good example of the color words. They usually refer to a color in the world, but it's not that simple. Some of the color words are different than the other ones. An example could be in Swedish, well, I think it's in English as well, cerise. It means a color, but it also means something unnecessarily specific. And the second meaning is usually much more important than the first meaning. Whereas the color red and the color green is almost having the same meaning. It's referring to the color green and red. But it's not that simple. I could add loads of problems here. Green is a very common color, extremely common. Whereas, for instance, the color blue is incredibly uncommon. And that shows in language. It doesn't show in the heads of the more analytical tended people. They think that all the colors are completely equivalent. And now I really try to find an example in language where the things almost have the same relationship between what the word is and what they refer to. But even in this case, it's a difference. And blue, you would say, well, you buy a pack of whiteboard markers, and then you have a blue, you have a green, you have a red one, you have a black one. And of course it's easy to think that the relations between the colors and what they mean are similar. They're not at all. Even in this, the best example I ever can come up with where there's an equivalence, there's still a big difference. For instance, blue, 90% of the languages on Earth don't have the color blue for a good reason. Because it's very, very uncommon in the world. It's not a color you see. Whereas green, when we look around, we see green all over the place. All over the place we have green. Blue, nothing is hardly blue in the world. But it's the sky, in some instances you can see the sky is blue. But you barely look at the sky, it's not important. What you look at is probably one small berry like the ones we picked today. Blue is very uncommon. And when you are in the Gerede, when you are in the everyday position and you do the idle talk, you are in the mood, you're doing things, you're going shopping, you're stepping up in the morning. You don't consider the words, they just work for you. What happens? The words tend to narrow. You don't know that there is a difference between the colors anymore. You don't do it on a bodily level and you don't do it on an intellectual level. And stepping on the method doing etymology is to discover that. It's when you have time. Maybe you are sitting in some coffee shop and you got bored with the newspaper you're reading and there's nothing interesting to look around, and then you start thinking, oh my God, there are hardly any blue color in the world. And why do I use the term blue like it had the same meaning as red? It doesn't. So this is fairly limited example, but that goes for all words. It goes for words like Heidegger mentioned Heimat, the house, wishing for the house, walking, all those things can have a broadening of meaning. And when you start stopping and think about these things, you get this broadening. Because what just happened now when I discussed this with the color, that was a broadening of these concepts that become more stable, more founded somehow. Of course, they will become even more founded if you were painting every day, which I did for like 10 years. Then you discover even more. Although in a very limited area. What Heidegger wants us to do, he says there is a possibility you can do it, opportunity. I think he wants us to go that way, but we don't have to. That is to apply that to all things in the world. And I actually think that's incredibly interesting. That's maybe one of the most interesting things you can do. And that's an ongoing process. You can stop it if you get fed up with it, if it gets too much. But later on you can get back to it. Because with this you will broaden whatever you touch. It will become broader. We never become more narrow. And here you really see the difference between what Heidegger is proposing and the scientific method, the technological thinking. They actually go in the exact opposing ways. I think that actually the last thing made it clear for me anyway when I said it. Well, ponder out those things. I will gonna have to make another go with this most interesting paper. And thank you very much, Kalle Lundahl, for bringing this to the fore. Well done. An applaud as you...
Thank you for your applause.
Cheers.
Cheers.